So this brings us to speculate a bit about what the implications would be for Homo erectus social relationships. Of course, this does have to be speculative. You can't dig up social relationships, but we can make some inferences based on what we see Homo erectus doing and where they're living. They have to be living in groups. That shouldn't shock anybody. We're primates. We do tend to live in groups. And they are cooperating in getting food, raising kids, etc. They could well be sharing food, maybe even more than earlier hominins did, maybe even an emerging division of labor. Maybe males and females are doing slightly different things. Homo erectus are probably giving birth to babies that have somewhat larger brains, which would make them a little bit more helpless, and they'd need a little more care. Remember, also, we don't have fur now, so babies can't just hang on, so they have to be carried. So females with babies might not have been able to travel as much or forage quite as much. We think that it's quite likely that they are using camping areas repeatedly, maybe caves and rock shelters. Shukutian could be an example of a campsite. There's also an interesting implication if they are using fire. Another thing fire does is that it can extend the day for us, extend into the evening. And that would imply maybe some more time around the campfire to hang out, to learn from each other. Many of the skills that Homo erectus are learning, making more sophisticated stone tools, how to find different kinds of food, more hunting, this would all require more transmission of cultural behavior from one generation to the next. And that extra time hanging out together in a campsite, maybe even with a round of fire, yeah, that could be part of it. Now that does bring up the question of communication. It's clear that erectus are communicating pretty effectively with each other. They are communicating and cooperating well to get food. They're living in groups, but don't forget that chimps are pretty good hunters, cooperative hunters without language at all. Yeah, they communicate through sound and gesture and body posture, but they don't use language to communicate the way modern humans do. And we have reason to believe that Homo erectus probably could not speak the way that modern humans do. Remember, though, that speech is not something that you have to have for language. Sign language is fully developed human symbolic language, but it involves gesture. So some of the first moves towards modern human-like linguistic communication might be gestural rather than spoken. Now, the first attempts to teach chimps how to speak were dismal failures. The problem was that they were trying to teach chimps language by teaching them how to talk like humans do. And it turns out that chimps can't talk the way humans do, and it has to do with the structure of their skull and their jaw. When we speak, we're using a bunch of different things to make sounds. We have our larynx, which is down in our throat. In males, that's a bit bigger than females. That's why men have an Adam's apple. And the vocal cords, we run air across them, and that creates part of our speech sounds. We also have the space above the larynx. Larynx is soft tissue, so it does not fossilize. And then there's the space above it that goes up into the base of our skull. It's called the pharynx. And then we also have the space in our mouth. We also have to have the ability to control our breath and the movement of our tongue very quickly and very precisely. There's a whole lot of stuff involved in speaking. And the reason that attempts to teach chimps how to speak didn't work was because they don't have a pharynx like we do. They don't have that big space above the larynx that allows them to produce a bunch of sounds. And the pharynx is especially important for producing a range of vowel sounds. If you look at this modern chimp skull, if you draw a line from the palate of a chimp across to the base of its skull, this space up here, that's the pharynx right there. And you can see that in a chimp it's not very big. If we look at a modern human, I've outlined it there, the pharynx space is much higher. We call this flexing of the base of the skull. A chimp has a fairly flat base of the skull. A modern human has a much more flexed base of the skull. Well, if we look at afarensis here, Lucy, you can see it's a lot like a chimp. Not a whole lot of flexing. These two pictures aren't as useful for us because they have the jaw kind of in the way. But here's a Homo erectus skull. I've again drawn that line across the palate through the to the base of the skull. There's a tiny bit more flexing than you'd have in a Afarensis or in a modern chimp, but not a whole lot. That suggests that they probably couldn't make all the same sounds that we can, especially not vowel sounds. On the other hand, Homo erectus do have expansion in a part of the brain, which we can see in the impression on the inside of a skull. Brains don't fossilize well, but you can see the impression of the brain on the inside of the skull. And it's an expansion in a part of the brain called the Broca's area. In modern humans, if you have an injury to your Broca's area of the brain, it tends to have severe effects on your ability to speak. It's part of your speech center of your brain. And what we see in Homo erectus is they do have some expansion of the Broca's area of the brain compared to modern chimps and compared to earlier hominins. So that suggests they might have better linguistic ability than a chimp does, more ability to learn language. And once people stopped trying to teach chimps how to talk and started teaching them sign language instead, it turns out they can learn some aspects of language. They can learn language to about maybe the ability of about a 5-year-old, 3 to 5-year-old human. So all of this, the slightly more flexed base of the skull, the expanded Broca's area, suggests that Homo erectus might have been able to communicate better. Plus, of course, they are passing on these cultural behaviors from generation to generation, so that suggests some better communication. They probably used a range of sounds, although not the full range of modern humans. Gestures, body postures. There's another issue with the Broca's area, too. The Broca's area is also associated with 3D spatial manipulation of objects, like making stone tools, for example. And this becomes kind of a feedback loop. We think starting to make stone tools starts enhancing parts of the brain that do spatial relationships of that sort and symbolic relationships, and those bits of the brain also end up involved in communication. So it becomes this feedback cycle. You're using tools more, you can communicate better, etc., etc. So we'll look next time at the species that succeeds Homo erectus, that comes after Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, who are starting to do some even more human-like things. So that will be next.